I'm going to introduce you to a new word today. Some of you may not have heard this word before. Some of you may have. It's a real word. It's a real word. It's actually in the dictionary. The word is FOMO. And I bet you thought it was a bad word, didn't you? No, when you first heard it. No, it's not a bad word. But it is a real word. It is a real thing. It's a term that has been introduced just in the last few years. The last probably 10, 12 years, the term has been invented. It's a social anxiety that is related to when you're doing something, suddenly you can't enjoy what you're doing because you're aware of what someone else is doing. Or I can't enjoy what I'm doing or who I'm with or where I am because suddenly I'm made aware of what someone else is doing or where they are or who they are with. And obviously the advent of social media has contributed to this. It's sort of like almost a fear of regret. But this is something that's been around for a long time, FOMO. In actuality, it is the fear of missing out, okay? This is something that's been around for a long time. I mean, they've done experiments with monkeys where you give a monkey a grape over and over and over again. He's happy with the grape until you give his friend monkey 2 grapes. Then all of a sudden, he's not happy with what he has. So it's been around a long time, but the advent of social media, where suddenly we can all the time see what someone is doing 24/7, where they post pictures of what they're eating or what their new car is, what they're driving, or where they live, their house, or whatever it is, or they're at the beach or whatever. And, it's just there to make you jealous. It's just there for you to look at and say, look what I'm doing and what you're not doing, okay? And so it inspires this fear of missing out. And it seems to be becoming even more prevalent in these days than it has been in years past, okay? And the reason for that is because what we have not just in social media, but in the world in general, and including in the advertising world and our economy that preys upon our desires, is that we have the invitation of options. Okay, we love having options. We love being able to choose different options. I mean, I grew up in a day where I thought the Piggly Wiggly had a lot of options. Okay, the little Piggly Wiggly in Abbeville, Alabama, where I grew up. The idea of a superstore like Walmart, that would have been incredible to imagine something like that could even exist. It wasn't even 40 years ago, wasn't even in anyone's mind at that time. But you think about it. You go to Walmart and just think about all the options you have just for cereal. I mean, there's a whole aisle from like here to this door of nothing but cereal on the shelves. You can have whether you like Lucky Charms or whether you like Wheaties or whatever, you can pick from a whole number of different options of cereal. The other day that Molly and the kids and I went to get some ice cream. We're standing in line to get ice cream at Brewster's. And look at all the different flavors of ice cream. Literally, there's like 20 different flavors, 25 different flavors. And I'm looking, and and there's people behind me. I'm holding a toddler, and so I'm like looking on, and I can't even think about it. So I got a milkshake. I didn't even get ice cream because I couldn't figure out of all the different options that I had to choose from. And as much as we love options, the truth is that more options, this might seem counterintuitive or it doesn't even make sense, but more options actually lead to fewer choices. The more options that you have, the less likely you are to settle on one option, the least likely you are to actually make a choice. I mean, isn't that true? You go to a restaurant and you see how many things are on the menu and you look at it, but then what do? You order what you always get. I mean, you look at it all. But all those options sometimes makes it harder to make a choice. But we love to keep our options open. That's why in this day and time, it seems to be harder and harder to get people to RSVP. You get that little invitation. It's click yes, no, or maybe. And I click maybe a lot because not just because I have a full calendar, I have a full schedule, a full life. But sometimes we pick maybe just because we don't want to commit because something better might come along. And then we don't want to be limited into that particular thing because of another option. The fear of missing out prevents us from making choices, to committing to where we are and what we're doing and who we're with. And so as a result, we're not able to enjoy anything that we're doing because our focus is always on what we could be doing, or specifically what the other person is doing. And what happens is that those options can create less happiness. As a result of all the things that we could be doing, of all the cars we could be driving, of all the houses we could be living in, of all the people that we could be in a relationship with, of what I could be wearing. I'm not enjoying what I am doing where I am in the present moment. More options can create less happiness. And what happens is, as a result of technology, we have now more access to more options than ever before. Options that people just a few years ago couldn't even have imagined. Well, as many options as we have to choose from, the world of the Apostle Paul had even fewer options. They didn't have superstores in Paul's day, in the first century. Paul couldn't choose between sandals or tennis shoes, or then which brand of tennis shoes you want to use. Okay, they lived longer lives in Paul's day. They didn't have access to Facebook and to be able to build a relationship with anybody literally anywhere in the world. In fact, even Paul's day, you didn't even have different translations of the Bible that you could choose from. There was just one, and it was in Greek. In fact, most people in Paul's day couldn't even read it. Not only did they not have it, they couldn't read. Now, Paul actually, compared to most people who lived in his day, Paul, whose birth name was Saul, he had probably more options or access to more options than the average person of his day. Paul grew up a Pharisee, or he was trained in the tradition of the Pharisees. He was mentored by someone who was on the Sanhedrin, which was the ruling council of 70 elders who ruled basically all of the Jewish people, or governed Judaism, the religion in that day. Paul was well educated. He could read and write. And on top of that, Paul's father was a Roman citizen, which means that Paul was born a citizen, which gave him certain rights. But there were seasons of Paul's life where, particularly because of his witness and faith in Jesus Christ, that he had less options than at other times of his life. Probably at any time of Paul's life, he had access to fewer options than you do right now as an American sitting here today. But there were certain seasons of Paul's life where he had access to even fewer options than at other times of his life. And we get a glimpse at what was going on in Paul's heart and in Paul's mind in those times. These were specifically times when Paul was in prison, or he was under house arrest, which happened several times during his ministry for the sake of Jesus Christ. As he spread the gospel, there were accusations, he was arrested, he was thrown in prison. And some of the letters that are in your New Testament were written in these times when Paul had fewer options than at other times, when he was in prison, for example. And one of those letters in your New Testament, they're called the prison epistles. Epistle is a letter, and they were considered by the church, they were written to different Christians in that day, and they were considered to be inspired, and so they were kind of grouped together and included in what is today known as the canon of the New Testament, considered to be inspired or authoritative works in the Bible. One of those letters is the letter to the church at Philippi, which we know of it as the letter to the Philippians. That's what we call it. And it's interesting that this letter that Paul writes while he was in prison, while he has access to fewer options than most other times, is actually one of the most joy-filled, perhaps it is the most joy-filled of all of Paul's letters. Paul talks about joy repeatedly over and over again in a time where it seemed like he should be the most miserable. When he's in jail, when he's in prison, when he's in a cell somewhere, and he doesn't have access to the relationships and the privileges that usually would accompany your everyday life. Paul speaks about joy over and over again in the book of Philippians. For example, in Philippians chapter 1, verse 4, and I remember he's writing to a group of Christians in Philippi, which was a city where he founded the church, Philippi was in Macedonia, which is the northern part of Greece there. Paul was traveling with Silas. They visited Philippi. They met a woman named Lydia, who was a seller of purple. Obviously, she was a woman of means. She converted. She became a believer, and the Christians started meeting in her house. Paul and Silas were arrested while they were giving a testimony, giving a witness, and a mob literally approached them. They were arrested, thrown in jail, where they were beaten, but an earthquake basically broke their chains. The jailer wound up coming to Christ. So all these things happened in Philippi. And so Paul's writing to a community that he is has a great deal of investment in. And he's writing from a prison cell. And he says, in all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy. Verse 18. He said there was things happening in Philippi. There were people who were coming along who were preaching, and Paul kind of questioned their motives about their preaching. But some of them seemed to be getting rich off their preaching, or some of them were kind of questioning Paul's integrity. And Paul's writing back to him, and he says, listen, the important thing, I don't really even care about that. The important thing, whether they're false motive or true, the most important thing is that Christ is being preached. These people, maybe they have different motives, but they're proclaiming Christ, who I'm proclaiming. And he says, because of this, I rejoice. Even though my reputation might be getting attacked, if Jesus is being preached, I'm rejoicing. And yes, I will continue to rejoice. Chapter 4, verse 4. Paul says it again. Rejoice in the Lord. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again. Rejoice. And then he elaborates really further on this joy. And he gives us a hint as to the reason for this joy, beginning in verse 10. And this is important. He says, I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Paul's in prison. He doesn't know whether they care that he's in prison or not. At least he hasn't known that. But what's happened is he's just received a letter from them that affirms that they are concerned for him. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. You didn't have an opportunity. They didn't know where he was, or that he had not heard from them. It wasn't that they weren't concerned. Verse 11. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, that I need you to be concerned, or I need that you to give me something. For I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. That content word, that's a key word. And that's a key word to associate with a feeling of happiness or joy in my own life. Joy comes from that feeling of contentment. Verse 12. I know what it is to be in need. In other words, I know what it is to have very few options. And I know what it is to have plenty. I know what it is to have many options, a multiplicity of options. And plenty for Paul is probably needy for us. And considering the wealth that we have today, Paul had, even in his most abundant seasons of life, didn't have the options that you have. But he says, I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I've been in both situations. And I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. More options or no options. I've learned the secret of being content, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Okay, that's the secret. That's what we want to know. How to be content. How can I be happy in a world where I'm constantly being bombarded with messages that want me to be discontented, unhappy with where I am, what I'm doing, who I'm with? How do you do it? Well, verse 13. I can do it. I can do all this. Some of your translations say, I can do all things. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Philippians 4:13. You ever heard that verse before? A lot of times it's told in terms of whatever you want to do, Jesus is going to help you do it. That might be a little bit of a mistranslation. Paul is writing in terms of contentment. I can be content in every circumstance, whether in plenty or in want, because of him who gives me strength. It makes no sense that I would be contented in a place of need in prison, but I can do it through him who gives me strength. You see, Paul could be content not because of options, not because of all that he could be doing, or what options could be available to him. No, Paul was content because he had made a choice. Paul could be content because he had gone all in with Jesus. He had settled on the main option, on the first choice. And when all the other choices were taken away, when all the other options were gone, Paul still had his first choice. He still had his primary option because Paul had settled on the option that could never be taken away. He had something that he knew he could never lose. And that's why we see this incredible irony, and I think it's true for us too. As other options fade away, we have no other choice but to settle on the main option, the primary option, the only option we have. And the fluffing away of other options for Paul, the removal of the other options that are taken away from him, it turns out they only intensify his love for the main option because he'd already settled on that. He'd already settled on Jesus. And we see this in the letter of the Philippians. Paul is in prison for his witness to Christ, and he writes with such passion in this letter. He says, I want to know Christ and the power of His resurrection. And he said, whatever I've lost, and he said, I've lost quite a bit. He talks about his pedigree and everything that he's done. But he said, I've given it all up for the sake of Christ. And he said, whatever options I've given up, I consider them rubbish, that I may gain Christ and that I may be found in Him. Don't you want to desire something like that? That you're so sold out, that you've set your course, that you've set your face, you're determined. That's contentment. That's joy. That's happiness, purpose, fulfillment. Well, I believe that that same joy and happiness and contentment that Paul experienced is available to you. I believe it. But it's going to involve a choice for you. And perhaps more importantly, it's going to involve a belief. You're going to have to believe something. And it's going to involve your belief about God, and particularly about the way God governs all things and the way He governs your life. This is what you're going to have to believe. And it's going to run counterintuitive to perhaps the narrative of consumerism, America, and maybe even social media. Okay? It is this: that what you need is always among the options you have. What you truly need is always among the options that you have. And that it could be that our unhappiness doesn't result from a lack of options. It's a result of a failure to settle or choose the main option. That's just a question, just something to consider, okay? So maybe the solution to our problems, the solution to our discontentment, the solution to living the life we want to live and we want to have, it isn't having more options, but it's committing yourself to the one you've chosen. And what is commitment? Commitment is a choice. And it's something repeated over and over again. It's choosing again and again and again. That's commitment. That's in a simple phrase. You make this choice and you make this choice, and it confirms your choice. And so, instead of always being focused on the next thing, or what someone else is doing, or the other place that I want to be in, or that other thing I want to be doing, that other person I want to be with. Instead, focusing on this place, upon this option, this person, this place, this what you're doing now. Because in truth, you're never going to be at the next place. You're never going to be with the next person. You're never going to be doing the next thing, only what you're doing right now. And if you haven't learned contentment, if you haven't really chosen, if you're not all in where you are now, when are you going to be? Who are you going to be all in with? Our theme for this series has been as a result of social media And the miracle of digital technology is that now we are available to everybody. I mean, literally anybody in the world can contact you at any time. That's a miracle, okay? And they can disrupt you and interrupt you at any time, at any moment. Literally through social media, Twitter, Facebook, that's possible for anyone in the world. But what's that led to is that we're actually not being present to anybody. We're available to everybody, but present to nobody. The people we actually live our lives with, the people that we live under the same roof with, our parents, our kids, our spouses, our friends, our siblings. We're always distracted, so we don't give them our full attention. We're available to everybody, but present to nobody. But we could also change this and say that we're available to everybody because we're always available. And we could always go here or there, choose this or that. That we've actually really committed to, or we've actually chosen nobody. Because we're afraid of missing out, because we won't make a choice, because we want to keep our options open, it turns out we don't really choose or enjoy anything. And the truth is, you can't be a follower of Jesus. We're going to have some young people today who are going to confess their faith in Jesus and literally going to go all in with Jesus over here in just a second. But you can't be a follower of Jesus and live like this. Because there are certain options you are going to give up to become a follower of Jesus. And to choose Jesus is to choose Jesus exclusive to some other options. So maybe the secret to happiness is not a multiplicity of options. It's not having more and more and more and more options. But it's exclusivity to the option you've chosen. Specifically, it's being committed to the best option. The secret to happiness is commitment to the best option, choosing the best option over and over again. And I want to make a case to you today that I believe that there's one option that's superior to all others. And I believe it's an option, ironically, even though it's the best option, it's actually one that's oftentimes the least chosen. It's chosen by a few. Many don't choose it, even though it's available to everyone. It's the one option you choose that when it comes to the end of your days, you won't regret. You won't regret anything you missed out on to choose this option. And it's the one option. This is what I believe. You might disagree. This is what I believe. It's the one option that can give you the contentment and the happiness, and maybe the better word is joy, that you long for. And that one option is one person, is Jesus. Today, I invite you to choose Jesus. To make today a day of decision for you. If you've chosen Him before, choose Him again. Today we're going to have some people to make that confession of faith. To go all in with Jesus. Won't you? I guarantee you won't regret all those things you missed out on because you chose and committed. You went with the best option and not all the other options that you could have had.